small scale.
Or is it possible that God is using terms in which people would be
Started by the people.
I think it's
just that's you didn't want to go down that road there.
Yeah, and there is I mean, I get it a little bit in terms of we have
I think the entire
everybody's going to have a bias that says like, oh, we know more than everybody before us, but that's demonstrably not true.
The Middleburg,
His main point was historically doesn't make sense. His other, a couple points. His other point was the Bible is not a science textbook, and so therefore it's wrong. But then he said, well, who can know really what science is unless you're a scientist and you got all this training?
Yeah, at that point, I in review thought of several points that I should have followed up on. You can't know anything about science unless you're a scientist. Basically also means, though, you can't know anything about physics if you're a biologist. So we'll take all the Richard Dawkins stuff and throw it out. You can't know anything about philosophy if you're a cosmologist, so we'll take all of the books that Stephen Hawking wrote, popular ones, and throw them out. You know, if you can only pronounce in your own initial domain, then what are the rest of us supposed to do? And if it's widely acknowledged that even in specialization, revolutions occur every 50 years, to say all the thinking beforehand was wrong, then all you're doing is betting for certain that the one thing that you're taking people's word on is wrong, likely to be wrong, found wrong. You know, it's a strategy.
His response to that idea was, well, everything's forward, now, but now we know.
I love it when I hear now we know. Because I'm like, go back 50 years, what did the textbook say? Go back 150 years, what did the textbook say? Go back 200 years, what did the textbook say? Now, why do we think it's not going to be the case in the future?
He actually. Well, I don't want to distract you. We can talk about this all day.
That's a great question.
I found it fascinating. I took all sorts of notes on my phone as we were talking.
Well, we'll get started just in the interest of time. Here in 1 second.
You also learned that you have a side correspondent.
Yeah, probably.
Well done.
There was oddly, you never, maybe you want this to be the case when you down. The most memorable line from that whole debate was, I have a 4-year-old daughter that walks like a duck and quacks like a duck.
An entire class answer, talking, discussing, and arguing over a really small part of whatever it is that we're talking about at large. Basically, you get the most obnoxious people in the church in one room, and you say, debate something for a long time. Can I make a comment?
On that note, let's get started. Yes, can you make a comment? So this class is for everyone to criticize, talk about what happened, what didn't happen, and ultimately probably what we ought to do next. But go ahead.
Monday night, I think you did a great job presenting everything, going through.
Well, thank you. But on that note, let me tell you one thing. I am exquisitely uncomfortable with being praised in public. So if I did anything well, please don't tell me that.
You are so stupid.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with that. What I would like to do, A, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. And B, let's for the purposes of the intellectual discussion in this class, let's treat the arguments for what the arguments are, and say, because one of the points that I didn't make in the debate that I wanted to at the end, but I didn't do it, was to say, because it would have been presumptuous to say, hey, as I was sitting here, it became apparent to me that the other side didn't even show up. There were no good arguments made against God's existence. There were none of the rebuttals to the arguments that were made for God's existence. Now, why is that the case? And what I wanted to say was, let's not blame John for this, because John is obviously a bright gentleman, a prolific author. He's done a lot of study on this one. And the point that I really wanted to make there was, the reason that John didn't do well in the debate is not because John isn't smart or that he doesn't know stuff. The reason he didn't do well in the debate is the same reason that I would do poorly in the debate if I was a flat earther and I was debating a knowledgeable person around Earth, spherical Earth. It's that the truth is just not on my side. And so you can you can do certain, you can have certain tactics. You can undermine, if your opponent has made weak assertions, if they are poorly founded in certain places, you can point those out and do well. If your opponent is not using valid logic, you can do very well. But at the end of the day, the weight of the truth among two roughly equal pairings, the weight of the truth can bear out well unless one is just rhetorically excellent. And so, in my opinion, one of the hallmarks, one of the reasons that you can say, have some confidence in the theist position here, well, let's say two reasons. One is Bill Craig has been doing this for 30 years, and he runs the exact same arguments every time. And he always does very well. That should tell you one thing, that they're unassailable. People know what he's going to say, and they still can't win. That's one thing. The other side is the tactic that is most successful against theistic arguments tends to be what, like Christopher Hitchens did. Christopher Hitchens, who's a terrific rhetor, who is someone who can, an orator, who can speak. Was a wonderful wordsmith. If you analyze what he did, all it was a series of basically insults, caricatures and insults against the faith. But it was fairly effective in terms of, if you're sitting in the audience and you're not analyzing the arguments well, it would seem like, oh wow, there's some really good weight on that side. Not when you break it down and you analyze it, but as you're sitting there, it does feel that way. But why use those tactics if logic is so heavily on your side? And the point is, there's really no need to. So, anyway, with that being said, what I wanted to point out was what I wished I would have been able to say, but it didn't seem appropriate nor called for at the time, was this is not John's fault. He's just having to argue a difficult position because it's not true. which is why I'm arguing the position I argue. I was asked in college to join the debate club. I refused. One of the reasons was I knew I would be terrible at arguing the side that I didn't believe in. Like awful. Because I tried it before and I was awful. So, and I didn't want to do it. I didn't feel like I didn't feel morally right making arguments about, if it was a moral topic. If the topic was, football is better than hockey, okay, yeah, all day long. But if the topic had to do with something moral, I didn't want to be on record making good arguments, trying to make good arguments for it. And then realize that I didn't have to worry about that because I couldn't make good arguments for it. All right, enough jabbering. That's the one thing I wish after that point. What else? Yes, sir.
Well, I just noticed after the debate, listening to different people talk after, people still revert to evolution as what about it?
Yeah, it was
I ended up hearing.
It was a topic that came up a lot, and so we saw one lady who felt very strongly on the topic ask a series of questions. Yeah. So it was obvious to her, and actually to me, that she believed a certain way. And I'll tell you, the guy I've heard say this the most. Solid ground used to be taught a decade ago by 4 people. Will Gaines, who you saw up there, Karthik Abram, who's still running around in this church doing a number of things, and a guy named Steve Blanchard. He and his wife have subsequently become missionaries to Ireland, and he was a former National Geological Survey geologist who believed that the number one threat to Christianity was belief in an old earth. Like, to him, young earth creationism and Christianity were identical, and if you said anything other than that, especially on the scientific front, in terms of old earth creationism, you were a heretic of the highest order, kind of thing. Maybe I'm caricaturing a little bit, but he did at one point say that this was the single most important topic in the world today.
It's like a Kantian view of it?
I guess so, but the idea was, I think that he thinks that the Bible very clearly says this is the way that it happened, and I think the idea in his mind, because he didn't say it to me particularly, was if that turns out not to be true, then all of the Bible is false. So the stance that I have wanted to take for a long time, that I have taken for a long time, is I don't know, I'm not sure why Christians, I have ideas as to why, but why is it that Christians believe, I'll back up and say something. I do believe that the entire Bible is the inspired Word of God. Let's push that aside for a second. If the Bible was not, if it was simply, and I'm not even saying what inspiration is, if the Bible was simply historical texts, to me, it's still enough to show that, in addition to the arguments like we gave, that God exists, that this is the God that we're talking about, and furthermore, that Jesus came to earth, claimed to be who he claimed to be, and rose from the dead. Now, Gary Habermas does his an analysis that basically says, if the Old Testament, given the facts that we have about the resurrection, just from an historical perspective, not from a biblical, belief in the Bible perspective, but just based on that, the most reasonable explanation is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if he did, then you've got this event that needs some explaining. It's like, what? Okay, that happened. What does that mean for us? If that approach, I understand the simplicity of saying, nope, here's a book. It was delivered wholesale. We've got it. We can read it, and we don't have to worry about what is true in any real sense. There's some comfort in that, but it's also not. It has problems in and of itself, which are clearly these are different interpretive frameworks you're supposed to be using. It's not all to be taken literally. The book of Revelation was not intended to be a literal book. The vision of some of the prophets was not intended to be a literal vision. Visions of things that literally happen, of bones being put back together and flesh being built around them. That's obviously a metaphor. So if there are different interpretive frameworks, it's not as simple as I just read it and it says what to do. It's not an instruction manual for putting together an IKEA furniture piece, which doesn't require language, I guess. But you have some folks in Christianity who I think are so passionate about the belief that creation was done in 6 literal 24-hour days, which it may have been for all I know, by the way, but that it is that way, that is identical to belief in God. And I just don't see that, and I'm not sure why the Christian, the theist, bears burdens that they need to do so. Yes, sir?
Oh, I was just saying thanks. You answered my first question there.
Okay.
Revelations be taken literally.
Yeah, I think not, only because...
Well, define literal. That's one of the problems, right?
Yeah, great point. So if literally means, do we think at some point, either in the past or in the future, there will be a woman who runs into the desert and a dragon goes after her, and then a river will open up and all that will happen? I think that the answer is fairly clearly no. Yeah. Partly because some of what was described in the book of Revelation appears to have meant to be talking about stuff that happened in the past, and also contemporaneous events, none of which included an actual dragon. So I think I would be very comfortable in saying I would be.
So the dragon would be more like the Antichrist. I haven't read through all the book yet. I'm still I'm being kind of careful before I go into Revelations because I don't want to go there kind of stupid. Because there are some people read it literally.
Yep.
And I've been watching that, and I'm I don't really know if that's.
I will say I've literally never run into a theologian that believes that all of Revelation is to be taken literally. Yeah. I don't know of a single one. Yeah. And I know an awful lot of conservative ones. Yeah. And I know some liberal ones. Okay. None of even the most conservative.
That's good. I just wanted to make sure that I'm making examples out of things that are not meant to be taken literally before going. Because Revelation is not really a book you want to go into right off the bat. Starting off your reading.
Well, to your point, Revelation presumes you know an awful lot about an awful lot of other things.
Yeah.
Because the messages that it's given, the references that it's making, depend on you knowing other things biblically that occur. You have to know the rest of the Bible fairly well.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have one more question also. For translations of the Bible, I've noticed reading King James, and then reading different versions. We were going over Ruth and Young Adults the other day.
Yeah.
And I noticed in one of the verses they were talking about laying a baby on a woman to take care of.
Yep.
And one King James says her chest, and another translation says legs. So it's I'm starting to see I'll go do a cross comparison on King James, and I'm starting to see these variations in words, and some of them are kind of critical, like a place or something like that is totally different. But putting a baby in one place versus another.
Yeah, it's funny because we'll get upset at translators sometimes for being like, what's the matter with these guys? They're obviously bringing their bias into it, whatever their bias is.
Yeah.
And that they do that, I think, a little bit unintentionally sometimes. Like if you read the ERV compared to the NIV, like I've heard Reformed theologians refer to the NIV as the non-inspired version, just because they don't like the way that the translation is done. But there are enough. We forget that it's not unique to modern language to say something like, "Yeah, I had the book in my lap," and you're like, "Oh, okay." And then, but this guy was raised in the lap of luxury, and you're like, "Well, it's the same word, so it obviously means on the top of the legs whilst in a seating position."
Yeah.
And you're like, no, like one of them was a metaphor and the other one was not, and so if you go back just even a couple hundred years, you'll hear people talking about, well, this is somewhat who wrote the Ivanhoe and subsequent Sir Walter Scott. He has his characters talk about, well, this is somewhat on the bow hand of truth, and you're like, somewhat on the bow hand of truth. So the literal interpretation, Jung's literal interpretation would say, this person's statement was bow-handed. And you're like, well, what does that even mean? Something about archery. And the bow hand is the left hand. And the left hand, at the time, was considered the less honorable, less true hand. And not because of the reason it was in the Middle East, but because of the reason it was in, because left and right were considered like metaphors for this was the correct way to do things, this was the incorrect way to do things. There's a great dad joke about how the left hand was named that has to do with that, which I won't tell here. But the idea was you could both extract from that a wrong belief that people 300 years ago, 400 years ago, 300 years ago, thought that people who were left-handed were morally wrong. Nobody believed that. People 400 years ago thought that this hand would write correctly and this hand would write untruths, things like that. But these are all conventions of language. And so when you're trying to go back 2,000 years or 3,000 years and say, what were the sayings at the time? Just think of how the term gay has changed from 50 years ago to today. And just if you didn't note that 50-year difference, somebody saying that this person was happy and effusive to this person was, identifies as homosexual, you would miss that nuance entirely. And imagine the confusion that would cause. And that's just one example.
For instance, we'll have a gay old time.
Right. And it's in a cartoon made in whatever that was. So
Yeah.
50s, yeah.
Was it 50s?
Yeah, for sure.
Gosh.
Wow.
Okay. Wow. Please refrain from making me feel that old. I didn't remember the original one. But, okay.
I think it's a good point with regard to the term literal, because the doctrinal view of inerrancy is that the Bible is true in all it asserts and affirms. So what is Revelation affirming or asserting? Is it asserting that this woman gave birth to a baby and went into the sea and all these things? Or is it trying to say something else and affirming that?
Yeah, it's interesting that people don't recognize something they recognize obviously everywhere else, which is truth is contained in a multitude of different genres.
Right.
So one could be like this coffee cup is black, and say, okay, is that true? Well, it's not true everywhere, but it's true a part of it, and what we mean by black. And so it's an even better statement to say this coffee cup reflects light in the 4.7 terahertz frequency. Okay. If you turn around and say this coffee cup represents happiness, that meme is all over Facebook, something about coffee and happiness. So there's a million things you could say there. But it's not less true in virtue of not being scientifically stated.
I'm sorry. What that also means is if the Bible is also written by people, right? In an arrangement with God who said, yes, this is what I want to give my people, then it's okay to have errors, right? Because people make errors.
Well, it depends on your doctrine of inspiration. So there was this is a fast one, but a lot of people conceive of inspiration as Scott got tasked to write the Bible by God. So for a time period there, he went into dictation mode and was taken offline as an independent thinker, and that the Spirit wrote this through him, and then almost kind of like he woke up afterwards and was like, okay, what have I written? Not quite that extreme, but that's the idea.
Overly strong.
Yeah, but the current modern doctrine of even conservative theologians is this was a confluent effort between God and man. So without getting into that, let me back up and answer the question I failed to answer the first time, and then go to the hands of the raised. On evolution, I don't know why anybody would take any position other than this. Evolution is not mathematically possible. Like if you understand the math behind it, then when someone starts talking about hydrothermal vents, you should laugh. And you should laugh for the same reason that if someone tried to say that we know that satellites could have gotten into orbit by somebody who's just strong enough, trying it often enough, of trying to throw a baseball into orbit, right? That is more probable by a lot than that evolution produces the complexity that you see today. And I don't mean that from a biological standpoint and naturalistic standpoint, and the failure of Darwinian natural selection to be a thing. Like grant it in its full power. The reason I brought up the example I did last time is, at least for abiogenesis, for a level that is wholly insufficient to even begin to think about starting life, it's mathematically so improbable that it can't be done. So I don't know why. Turn around and say to the person who's a Darwinian evolutionist that believes that all this happened from an unguided process, and say, we agree math, let's do the math. And when you do that, like it doesn't get off the ground at all. So, it may be the case, for all we know, that if there are eons built into the Genesis days, that some of that could have happened. So there's no reason to get, what if it is true? But the bottom line is, it's not true randomly. It's not true by chance. And that's a mathematical certainty. Yes, sir and ma'am, and then we'll go this way.
Yeah, I was just going to mention two things. It does say like Herod was a fox in the New Testament. And if you do like a word study, like what does fox mean? It's like, it means small fuzzy animal. Everywhere else in Scripture, it's like, so he must have been a small fuzzy animal.
Yeah, right.
And technically, I think people take the line where it's like, don't rely on the philosophies of men.
Yes.
And take that to be like, we can't come to the Scripture with anything but the Scripture, and like, even though they do come with pre-assumptions, like they don't recognize that they do, and they're just like, even if the interpretation doesn't make any sense, by saying it doesn't make sense is relying on philosophies of men. Saying it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so I agree, and it comes to do with what level of pre-commitment. So, and to your point, or maybe not to your point, I'll add on to your point by saying the following. Regardless of what your thought of how John did in this last debate, I happen to think that he didn't do very well. I'm biased, but I don't think he showed up to the debate well. Despite that fact, never mind. I'll let the point stand alone. I'll add to it later. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say, like, it's interesting to see what people say is literal in the Bible versus not. Jesus never specifically says when he goes into his parables, by the way, this is a parable, this didn't really happen, I'm just giving you a moral lesson. He just said, there's a man who had 2 sons, blah, blah, blah. So why does everyone accept that that's just a story tool that he used, rather than him saying this literally happened?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess what I was going to say was, I've had people who want to defend the literal interpretation of the Bible, of Genesis, so hard that they defend that all of the Bible is literally true, that there's nothing in there that's story or allegory or metaphor or mytho-history or anything like that. And so I'll say, like, do you think Job was? Those are the words they literally spoke. I said, yeah. I'm like, do you know that in Hebrew that's metered poetry? And they'll blink for a couple times and say, well, I mean, God could have inspired them all to speak that way. But yeah, that's true. He could have. But in the same way that if I'm going to tell you a story and I start it with, once upon a time, there was a man. Nobody in here is like, oh, hang on, this is literal history. I wonder exactly who the man was. We're all like, Scott introduced that in such a way that he was telling a fairy tale or a parable. So I think that it's wise to try to come to the Bible, to all the evidence, but the Bible as well, with an open mind. So that, and this is one of the things I strongly dislike. This is one of the reasons I didn't try to get a degree in theology, is you pick what you're going to be taught when you select your university.
Sure.
Right? Find me the theological school that's so open-minded and broad that they don't teach anything at all in terms of pre-commitment to doctrine. Does not exist. Understandably, why? Like, I get why. I'm not criticizing it like, well, obviously there's an easy answer to this one and nobody's doing it. It's not that. It's just you're going, the people who put the work in for a reason. And the reason tends to be that they have beliefs about it. And the beliefs tend to be things that drive the way that they think. Yes, sir.
So, for most people who know, I'm Catholic. And in my groups, we always find it kind of funny when Protestants have the literal interpretation. Because we go, well, what about that one portion in the Bible about the body and blood? It's like you take everything literally except for the portions that you don't want to take literally.
Yes, right.
So I would find that a little bit comical.
They do seem to be exceptions when you get backed into a corner. Right?
Yeah. When you were talking about evolution, were you specifically talking about macroevolution or both macro and micro?
Well, that's the point, isn't it? Which is, evolution is genetic variation, random genetic variation, and selection of some of those subsequent variations by quote unquote natural selection, which is tautological, right? The survival of the fittest. How do we know they're the fittest? Because they survive. Why do they survive? Because they're the fittest. So that doesn't actually help you. But what you can do is posit that as a filter for things that are going to survive better are going to survive better. And so you would expect if there's variation that the things that are going to survive better will do better. Great. It shouldn't be a surprise, right? Not a major new idea. There shouldn't be a major new idea. The problem is that selection mechanism over only random variation cannot mathematically produce anything like the diversity that we see now. So macro to micro evolution is irrelevant on a time scale in that there's no way that billions of years are not enough time, not even close. Like when they say not enough time, like, if they'd only had another 100 million years, they'd have gotten there. No, if they'd only had another several lengths of the universe, and when I say several, I don't mean 7. I mean 10 to the 50th universes. You still wouldn't get one change like the changes that people are positing here. It's so mathematically ignorant that it's hard to explain. It's like trying to explain this is going to sound insulting, but it's not, because all of us have been here. But it's like trying to explain to a 5-year-old why their understanding of calculus is not correct. It's hard to put it in those terms and in this case, it's because the 5-year-old refuses to learn the material. And we're all guilty of that.
Until Mike and Katie have a 5-year-old.
Right, and then let it begin. That's right. Yes, sir.
Just to add on that, I am here today because I was in grad school a couple of years ago studying computational genetics.
Yes.
And the professor were explaining how the human cell, all the cells in general are fantastic computing.
Yes.
And that was developed over billions of years of evolution. And when we got to program, to create a program to make the alignment of a file with the transcription of the DNA, I looked at the size of the file.
Right. You're right.
And I said, okay, let me try to calculate the probability of this get assembled by itself. It broke any computer that I tried.
Right.
You can't. That was the moment that I realized the impossibility of the inexistence of God.
Yes.
Because that strand, that transcription of the DNA would never assemble itself by random chance.
And this point right up here brings up two that I really wanted to, and you got maybe both, and I think it was just you, and I have talked about this in the past, of if you think about, so the point here was an epiphany, and anybody who has thought about it long enough and looked at it and had this epiphany recognizes it as an epiphany. Because we grow up being told this can happen. And then when you run the math on it, you're like, this cannot happen. So the slide that was the most annoying slide up there, the 99.999%, like that's not some theistic exaggeration. That is true. And it is truer than I can even depict on the slide. And I think what John was trying to say was there may be a consensus of science as to your points about the universe began to exist. There's not a consensus of science that God exists. So you must be wrong. The point that I wanted to bring up, and he and I have talked about before, is people will tell you things like, I don't believe in God. And if you say back to them the following, yes, you do. They typically think that you're saying what? If you tell somebody you actually believe in God, you don't think you do, but you actually believe in God. What do most Christians who say that really mean? Yeah, that you know deep down that he's there, but you're actively denying it because you want to suppress it for your own sinful desires. Right. There's another reason other than that. Maybe that's true, but there's another reason other than that, which is all of us believe stuff that we don't realize we believe. And what I mean by that, what we had talked about was you sitting down in front of like a famous podcaster who doesn't think that they believe in God. And then you run them against the premises of these deductive arguments over the course of an hour-long conversation, you probably mostly by challenging the truth of it and saying like, oh, I think things can just, I'm a Christian, so I think that things can just come to exist without any cause to them, like it can magically happen. And I think science shows us that. And the person will be like, what are you talking about? Like, no, everything that happens that comes into existence has a cause. Like that doesn't not, and you could get the person to argue for the premises. Then, because they believe this, like in a vacuum, if you ask somebody, do you think that things pop into existence uncaused out of nothing? Nobody will take you up on that. Everybody will be like, no, obviously not. And if you say, do you think that the universe began, do you believe, Big Bang Theory, the universe began to exist, is probably right. They'll be like, yeah, probably. And you put those things together, deductively, you're at a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful personal mind.
Right.
Right? You don't, like, it's not even controversial. It shouldn't be controversial because the logic adds straight up with no room for exception. So people believe those things, don't understand what they believe based on other beliefs that they have. That's an awkward way of saying it. You hold a set of beliefs that if you add them together, turns out it means you believe oftentimes contradictory things. One of the things that Michael and Katie have been talking about helping as well on this, because she actually has the expertise to do some of what we're talking about. We have talked about, we would love to build a back end and a program that lets you say something like do a survey. Here's a survey of 100 questions. What do you believe? Do you believe that effects need causes? Yes. Do you believe, to run down this whole list of stuff you believe. And then it will spit out for you, like, given that you believe 1, 17, and 34, you actually can't consistently believe 200 and 192. And because it'll show that these things are contradictory. That's useful in that at a minimum you can strip your beliefs down to the actual things that you not even can prove, but that you can consistently state are true. I wish Christian theology was subjected to this treatment. I wish our basic beliefs were subjected to this treatment. And so I think there's a lot of value in doing so, because it also means that you could enter an argument. It's 2 arguments into a computer and the assumptions that the arguers are doing, and it can spit out for you like, this guy could be right, this guy's definitely wrong. Or both these guys are definitely wrong. But it wouldn't turn around and say either one of these guys could be right. Like it'll tell you straight out, like this guy can't possibly be right because he contradicts himself at the key points.
So taking the issue back, I've talked with my family at various times about theological things or sort of philosophical discussions, let's call it. And within my own,
I know he can stomach this. Let me interrupt him briefly. Can you guys give me the high sign 5 minutes beforehand? I want to make a request of the class interview at the end of it.
And within my, my siblings and stuff like that, we're talking, they're all saved, all believe that there is absolute truth, right? In the God of the Bible. And at one point, I was like, well, those views are incompatible, right? And they're like, well, what do you mean they're incompatible, right? And to be fair, none of my family cares as much about, they're not as intellectually curious as I am. But when I explained, this is what it means, incompatible views, where what you said here argues against what you said here, right? And I explained that, they were just like, well, why does that matter, right? And I found that incredibly hard to explain, why should you have, compatible views. Why should what you say, or like, and I feel like I eventually worked through like why that should matter. They're just like, I don't care, right? And I was like, if you have someone here who says like, I believe that there is absolute truth, yeah, but I don't care that what I say is in line with reality, right? Like that's, how can we ever expect when we're talking with a unbeliever, right? Sort of like John Loftus, like in the debate at one point, you sort of pointed this out. You're like, well, what? You're like, you keep saying like trust science. This is literally the standard theory. This is the current consensus of science. These are the logical implications. And his response is just, oh, well, we don't know everything yet. Like, oh, which is essentially just, don't really care. Like.
Yeah, if you took him, so I happen to think that he's adopted this position over time because he realized that it's not, we can't argue supportively from that.
Yeah.
But let's say that a more charitable interpretation. I actually think that most people don't care about knowledge. Why would most people not care about knowing what's really true?
Because they'll disprove what they believe.
Maybe, but to what end? Like, what is it that they want?
Social consequences?
Lives. People want what's practically good for them in their eyes.
So, like, what both of them have said, all three of them have said together, I think, is what the answer is. People are only really interested in being happy, and they have not, over time, found that knowledge makes them happy, or that correct knowledge makes them happy. In fact, what they probably found out over time is, on many occasions, not knowing things makes them happier than knowing things. Okay, so if you have been brought up for 12 years in an education, now forgive me, can I rant for 30 seconds? Is that okay? You brought up in an educational system that will tell you overtly, I'm going to get in full rant mode on this one, tell you overtly that thinking logically and scientifically is the best thing that you can possibly do, and then fails over 12 years to ever give you a single course in logic, which they say is the absolute basis of thinking, then you should look at them and say, explain to me why I should trust you that you have any idea of what you're doing. Any idea at all. You don't. The second major portion of that is, if it's the case that people can't correlate knowledge and happiness, it's because a lot of the knowledge they're being taught doesn't appear to have any obvious correlation to their own happiness. And why would that be the case? Well, go back and consider what you have been taught over time in high school and in college. And someone, half jokingly, half seriously, said, we're going to set up a course for $3,000 where you pay us $3,000, and what we will teach you in the course of that are the facts and principles that you will actually remember after 12 years of primary education and 4 years of undergraduate education. That the amount that you retain from that one can actually be condensed down to a 2-month course that costs $3,000, and you'll walk away with the exact same amount of knowledge that you did beforehand. And we're like, that actually might be true, right? Which is unnerving that's even possibly the case. Because a lot of what I don't know your thoughts on, I'm going to come from a more engineering perspective, so I'm more likely to be slightly dismissive of some of the humanities, but I can tell you that I gave up in AP English on the humanities whatsoever after days of discussion about what an author truly meant by these following 3 different things, and I was like, did anybody ever ask the author what they meant? And they were like, no, it's just up to us to interpret. I'm like, but you're saying it like it's true. Like, she wrote the book, and this is what she was thinking. And all of you are not interested in asking her, and she's still alive.
Yeah.
Like, go and ask her, right? So, like, is this a metaphor that's supposed to stand for this? Ask. Nobody was interested in doing that. I'm like, you literally care more about making up things and saying they're true than you do about doing write a letter. Write a letter to them. I'm an English teacher at this place. Our class has been discussing this for a while. What did you mean here? Nobody wanted to do that. And so at some point, I gave up on our own educational process. And the reason I did was it is incredibly inefficient. And I think that most people know that. And they sense that intuitively. So they're going to say, why should I spend 12 years of my life, and maybe another 4 years of my life, and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, pursuing knowledge, and it is not correlated to happiness for me. All it did was correlate to sheepskin that got me a better job. Thank you, got that one. What about the actual knowledge? Which is terrible, right? Because the right knowledge absolutely is life-changingly good. But you have to figure out how to get to that. So the first step is convincing people that true knowledge will actually make them happier, which is why one of the reasons that I classify things in terms of, correlate things in terms of happiness in this class. Yes, sir.
Just because you mentioned that, I just want to say one of the best apologists I know, Jimmy Aiken, didn't go to college. And he just did study on his own, but that's beside the point. The question I wanted to ask. In your opening arguments in the debate, you mentioned that God chose this world out of other possible worlds.
Yes.
Can you go into that a little bit and how that would affect freedom, free will?
Yes.
Because it seems like God's dictating everything at that point.
Yeah. I find, so first let me point you to who's got the best answer to this one. And I do think William Lane Craig on Reasonable Faith has answered the question of very well. Does the fact that God knows something ahead of time means that he makes it happen? Because this is something that we run into all the time. And in fact, someone came up after the debate and asked exactly that question. Like, isn't it the case that God knows what you're doing ahead of time, and he's the one that actualizes the world, that he's the one, like, there's nothing you can do about it. There's no choice that you have. So I used to use a guy named Skylar Jaron in here. Now Michael has been my favorite, and his lovely bride has been my favorite target here. If I took my coffee cup, actually I'll use Skylar because he's not here, and also he was an Air Force security police guy, so he was a cop. I said that if I took my phone and I slung it at his wife Julia, that I know a couple of things will happen. One is that he'll intercept the phone, and the second is that he will quickly issue a beatdown as a result. So why do I know that would happen? Now I'm human, so let's say I don't know that, but I have high confidence it'll happen because of how well I know him, what I know about his character, what I know about who he thinks he is, what I know about what he has done before, all those kinds of things. They add up to me being able to say, reasonably saying that if I sling a phone at his wife, something like this is going to happen. Now let's give me a little bit more godlike powers, and let's say I've got the I forget how he does it, but I've got the Doctor Strange time stone. I can turn time back or whatever else. And so I'm going to do that in this class. All right. So I sling my phone at his wife, and I see what happens. He grabs the phone, he puts it down, he comes up here, he punches me in the face. Let's say that was course of action A. And so now, did I make him punch me in the face? Question to you. No. So what I did was I set in motion a chain of events that allowed him to put a choice on it. The choice was, here is somebody who has wrongly assaulted my wife. What am I going to do in response? And what he does in response represented his free choice about what he would do. And for the sake of argument, let's just grant him that he has free will. And all that he's doing is responding to the choice I presented him, which is, what are you going to do about this? Then I back up, I do my time stone thing, I back it up. And this time, instead of throwing my phone at her, I pay her a compliment. Like, hey, that was a really good observation. Thank you for doing that in this class. And he instead, feels some minorly warm regard for me for not insulting his wife and issuing a minor compliment. Did I make him do that? No. So regardless of which one, then I back it up again, and I'm like, do I feel like I get punched in the face today, or would I like to make people feel a little bit better? Let's say I choose I want to make people feel a little bit better, and so I set into motion by my choice which of those two things I'm going to do. And because of what I do, he responds to the choice that I presented him with his choice. And I, knowing ahead of time, could have written down in here, like, you're going to feel this particular way about this compliment that I paid your wife. And people wouldn't be like, ooh, magic. People would say, like, okay, that's not a big deal, because we knew it was happening naturally. But ultimately, I could do that to a high degree of specificity later, and people would say, like, did you make me do it? We can see from the analysis, though, that all I did was I knew which choices I was going to present to him. Now, if I'm a really good chess player, and what I want is for Skylar to be, let's say I know that by throwing the phone at him, by the subsequent fight that happens, by he and she walking out, that they will then run into somebody outside who is in a very fragile emotional state. And if somebody stopped and talked to them, and they were kind, good-hearted people, would bring them up from the depths of kind of the depression into which they were going. It just happened to be that time of day, that place in their life. Or alternately, if they treated this person harshly, they were going to go home and commit suicide. Those are two possibilities that happen out there. And I set into motion the one course of action where he walks out angry, and not because he doesn't like this person, but just because I have put him on a tough emotional path, that he blows this person off, ignores them, they go home and kill themselves. Like I picked this very macabre version of this to be extreme. And the idea there is, if what I really wanted to do, if I was evil, and what I really wanted to do is say, I want that person to die, I could set that emotion without my direct interaction with that individual by throwing my phone at a completely different person. And it looks like I'm in control, because by my knowledge of what was going on and my initiation of certain actions, I caused something to happen. Conversely, if I was really good, what I could do is say, that person's in an emotional state, I need somebody to bump into him at the right time, I pay this compliment, it happens this way forward, now good things happen. And this is why in this analysis, I have only human level free will, but divine level knowledge. They have human level free will, and the interaction of my free will and divine level foreknowledge is enough for me to control everything that happens in the world within my scope of whatever I'm thinking about. So now give God all the powers he has, and you'll see that if he can play four-dimensional chess and make his outcome happen given the free choices of other people within certain parameters. Okay, so if there were those four groups of people, if there is a group of people that no matter what you put in front of them, they never will choose eventually to do the right thing, then there's just no way God will ever do that. We'll be able to make those people come his way. But to your question now, all that's background to possible worlds. If it's helpful, don't forget possible. I think you understood it. I think you did understand it. Never mind. Some people don't understand possible worlds just means possible ways the actual world could be.
Yeah.
But obviously you got that. In this case, the way that God selects the worlds depends on the outcomes that he wants. And what I'm positing basically out there is that God can look at all the possible worlds, and let's say that he runs an Excel spreadsheet function over them and says prioritize possible world numbers by rank top to bottom most people who go to heaven to least people who go to heaven down the list. And and line 1 is possible world 5,713,A. And so he says, what is necessary to actualize that one? What choices do I have to put in front of people? What actions do I have to take? What souls do I have to drop in what bodies at what time? And that he does that, and he gets world 1 out of it. That's the idea. Or he gets world 1,000,000.
Would you agree that is or seems to be God rigging your decision?
No, it's God choosing the world that he wants based on the choices that you will freely make. Now, does that put him ultimately in control of what happens in terms of outcomes? Or better said, who's maximally in control of the outcome? As much as anybody as God is. But that should be uncontroversial to the Christian. God's most in charge of what happens. Show me your surprise face. Right? The question is not, is God most in control? Everybody from the free will, the open theist, all the way down to the quadruple predestination, if there is one. Is there a quadruple predestination? Is going to say God's in control. The question is, what does that control actually mean? Is he reaching into your mind and making you do it, or is he presenting you freely the choices? The open theist has an interesting version of this too, which is God doesn't know what you're going to freely choose, not because he lacks power, but because it's logically impossible to know what another free creature would freely choose in the future. Does that mean that God is out of control? If he's really smart, what he can do is say, what are all the reactions that a particular individual would have at this time? And then what would the things I have to do to contain that reaction in such a way that it happens in a way that I want it to eventually? And he could still get that kind of world, even if in an open theistic world, in my opinion. I still think he can maximize the number of people who are saved by cleverly presenting them all the choices that they would need in order to make that decision in the best possible light.
So just importantly, though, you could say that if God knows what you're going to do and that person actually chooses something else, well then God's knowledge would have been just that.
Would have been different.
Yeah, it would have been different. Yeah.
That's the way Craig explains it. Is if you had chosen a different way, God's foreknowledge would have been different. But while temporally prior is God's knowledge, what's causally prior is your choice.
Yeah. It's not future causation.
Right.
Just a comment. I feel like somebody has to stand up for humanities in class.
Thank you. Please do. Yeah.
I think that
it was over Ethan Fromm, and I don't think anybody agrees Ethan Fromm is okay. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I don't know.
Ethan Fromm was a classic book that everybody had to read.
Oh.
It was just
it was all, yeah, I
It was
read
boring.
multiple books and I stuff too. But I think that the point is that you made the point that knowledge doesn't make people happy because they don't see the beauty of it necessarily. That's what humanities are designed to do, right? Arts and everything else is designed to make it beautiful, so that we have knowledge to actually appreciate what we live in. And some people,
And that's a good point. And different people see beauty in different things. Like a true artist sees beauty in stuff that I'm like, I don't even know what I'm looking at here. The engineer sees beauty in a bridge where you're like, oh, that was a really clever way of doing it. People are like, that's an ugly bridge. Oh, you don't understand. Yeah. No, you're right. Well defended. The humanities are more secure. You're having been here. Thank you for that.
Just to really quick, to further defend the humanities, did you write the letter to him?
Right. So I will. No, I didn't, because I just gave up and said I don't care about this. In all fairness, I did the same thing to physics. And the reason I didn't pursue physics professionally was, so I've told this story maybe in here before. I'll do the short version of it. I thought relativity was this fascinating topic, and I was thinking about it since I was a little kid. And when I was, in middle school, my mom was like, I'm tired of hearing this kid jabbering. I'm going to go drag him in front of a scientist and shut him up. So she took me in front of this professor. I laid out how I understood it, and he was like, yeah, you basically got it right. In a nice way. He was like, for a kid your age, that's pretty good. Keep thinking about it. And so I was fascinated with the idea. It seems like a very interesting, amazing idea to me, and I wanted to understand what it meant. And I hate limits, so I'm like, why is this limit here? Yeah, explain to me the justification for these limits that relativity poses on the world, axiomatically and otherwise. And so I went and sat down with my undergraduate university's acknowledged expert, local expert in relativity, like the guy who's not well published in the field or anything like that. And I outlined for him, I was like, tell me why this doesn't challenge the notion that superluminal massive particle travel is possible. And I lay out this argument, and his first reaction was, I can't believe you've gotten through this university with this bad an understanding of vector addition. And I was like, I understand why that appears that way. Let me put it in other terms. And I rewrote it for him, and he said, he paused for, it must have been 15 seconds in tedious reality. And he said, I've never thought about that before. I don't know the answer to it. And my question was not way far down the way in relativity theory. This was a very fundamental, foundational concept. And his answer was, I haven't thought about that. And my conclusion was, if the expert hasn't thought about the foundational portions of his theory such that he can answer this fairly simple elementary level question, then what hope do I have that when I come out the other end of it, that my knowledge is going to be true knowledge? And so after a little bit more look into it, I was like, you know what? I think I give up. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this on my own. Because what I believe was to be educated in something where the foundations are uncertain or rotten is to waste your time. Because the history of science is assumptions or thoughts, building of edifice, eventual detection that this doesn't work, and the whole edifice comes down. And so if you had a PhD in string theory, as an example, your PhD is worthless now. Because, well, not, so there's still some people who are sort of holding out on string theory. But let's go back to, I was skipping my mind. What was the theory of phlogiston? If you had your PhD in phlogiston theory, literally worthless. And how much of what we know is literally worthless? And I think string theory is one of those. Like, you should have turned around and said, a one-dimensional string cannot possibly be the basis of reality, because if you go one step or two steps below, you'll find out that a one-dimensional string contains contradictory assumptions in it and cannot therefore possibly be true. And so the rest of it is nonsense. And that, to me, has been the challenge.
Value of the Bachelor of Arts over Bachelor of Sciences. But that's not my point. My point was that we've talked, I feel like, the conversation earlier about determinism and stuff, an important solid grounds thing that, if this means that people should be mentioned, is that forced is that, like, in a free will scenario, you can't force a decision, right? And like everyone's initial flag is like, whoa, that doesn't make sense. I can point a gun at you and make you do something. You can't. You can only really weigh the decision. In my mind, right? If you point a gun at me and say, I can make you pick up the chair, no, you can't. I can always choose not to and die, right? And it's like, well, that's not a choice. It still is a choice, right? You can never actually force anyone to do anything, right? You can heavily weigh the scales, right? So you're like, now I've got you. You love fish. Pick up the chair, or I, like turn the temperature up on your fish tank 12 degrees. And you're like, darn it, you found my weakness.
Yes.
I will lift the chair, right? But I'm ultimately still making a choice that I value, the lives of the fish more than I value my pride in being stubborn and not picking up the chair, right? And it's a trivial, silly example. I'm sure you can make that decision a very weighted decision, right? When it's like when you're talking about, I'll commit genocide against, some country, like Ireland. I'll go kill off all the people of Ireland unless you nuke South Korea, right? Oh, well, that's a really weighted decision. There's a lot going into there. You're still not forcing me to make a decision. You can never actually enter my conscious and force the decision.
You mean you can't force a particular choice?
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So you can force a decision in that you can set the clock and be like, you have to choose one thing or another, but you can't force them to choose a particular.
Well, even there,
choice.
you can't. I mean, you can't force the decision in that I can still. I mean, you're forcing the decision.
Well, I mean, you could say like
not to act, but yeah.
Right. I'm going to nuke Ireland unless you tell me to change to South Korea.
Yeah.
All right, and I'm going to do it in 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7. So you still have to choose which
Right.
place gets nuked, but.
Well, you don't, because you always have the choice to not act.
Right, but not acting means Ireland.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yes, sir. And then Seth.
In the same vein, he's talking about you can't force somebody to do something by pointing a gun at them. In the same sort of reasoning applies to arguing and logic. Okay, you cannot convince somebody of any argument whatsoever unless they choose to accept the thing that you're arguing for.
Yeah, and the real question, that is 100% right. And the most interesting portion of that question to me is, let's take as an example, like there are going to be people who are going to be stubborn enough that you're like, I'm not choosing. Well, you're not choosing is a choice. Well, I'm still not choosing. That's on you. That's not on me. And he puts it on the other person. Mm-hmm. And I think you can do that to a high degree, maybe completely. But the person, I will say, like in a debate, whatever side you're representing, even if it's blatantly obvious that you've just gotten crushed, nobody turns around and is like, you know what, I'm going to call this for the other team. I'll throw in the towel. You've won this one. Well done. I'm converting to your viewpoint. That never happens on the ground. It will happen later. So I'm trying to remember, Craig debated a guy, Peter, I forget who it was, who stridently was against Craig's position, eventually converted, not on the grounds, but part of his calculus had to have been how well his ideas did in competition with these other ideas. So what is it that causes, or the best way to ask the question is, what can you do to maximally open somebody's mind to the point where they're willing to consider both sides as well as they possibly can, given that considering as well as they possibly can entails that they have to have a good logical framework for comparing ideas, and none of us have been educated in that one, unless you went and took specialty courses or did it on your own. Like, this is a hard problem in modern society. It was a hard problem always, but a hard problem in modern society. Yes, sir?
And so the answer to that is God chooses them. You know, we have...
God chooses for you, or chooses what?
No. 1 Corinthians describes for us how people cannot understand the things of God unless God himself, not them,
yes.
Nothing in them,
yes.
But God opens their mind. I'm paraphrasing a lot here, but God chooses somebody and he says, I'm going to open their mind, they're going to understand me. And so they do. And another person is not chosen, and nothing in the world is going to make them understand. And some of those people whom God has not chosen have become extremely religious people, and they've studied and Bart Ehrman, God, I don't think God chose him, and yet he studied the Bible and this and that. but he's never gonna understand the truth that he believes a lie.
Do you think everybody who understands then chooses God? So here's
Yeah,
a setup.
I think it's a two-way thing. I think God chooses them, and then they choose God because they're incapable of choosing God, but then they become capable because he made them capable.
All right, so here are people who
Does that
don't.
make sense?
Yeah, so here are people who don't understand, and they'll say, and then God doesn't choose to make them understand. Okay?
Right.
So they're just in darkness. Here, God says, okay, I'm going to let you guys understand. These are the people that understand. Does this entire wedge of people then choose to love and obey God? Or is there some subsection that's like, okay, now that I understand, this portion is still going to say not interested, and this portion says, yes, I will now follow God. Which one of those two options is it? Is it everybody who understands converts, or is it a subset of people who understand convert?
That one I have a tough time distinguishing. You know, I can distinguish those who don't understand. That's really easy, and I can distinguish those who do understand and follow. You know, you're adding that extra thing on there, the following part. So I don't know whether there's that other wedge exists where they understand but reject anyway.
Right. And ultimately, I'm just trying to figure out where a man's will comes in. Because that would be an example of where free will would come in. Okay, these guys don't get an option to go to heaven for whatever reason. These people do, but some of them chose to obey and some of them didn't choose to obey. This is an important question in theology. Sorry.
What I think came up in the debate, and also your example with the edifices, people are really uncomfortable with any unscoped statements about reality, where maybe that comes from like how we limit every like scientific like physicalism, where it's like, oh, we have these Newton laws, but it's like, oh, once we go quantum, like it doesn't apply anymore. In the same way, people are like, oh, there's this causal principle, and I'll hold to it. But some people are like, oh, when we go quantum, like I'll abandon it. Or if I go outside the universe, like Loftus mentions, like, oh, once I'm outside the universe, like I'll throw away the causal principle. I'll just keep that scope to like this one section. So it's like anything unscoped is
unqualified.
Yeah, it's like we don't know because I don't have like infinite knowledge, so like I can't state anything unscoped, and so there's always that exit door. And I don't know, people are just really uncomfortable with like anything unscoped because I think they need omniscience to know that.
Yeah, so I can maybe respond to this in two ways. Well, let me give me 2 minutes to run an argument on you, and then I'll relate it back to why I mentioned it here. Sam Harris wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, and in The Moral Landscape, he says that you can, in the same way that you can make a statement about what's healthy and what's not healthy, without and some magical objective standard, then you could do the same thing about morality. So what he says is, like, it's fairly obvious to all of us that not vomiting all the time is a healthier outcome than someone who's throwing up like 24/7. So in the same way you can make that statement medically, why can you not make the statement that basically says the well-being of conscious creatures is the scale that you're using, and that really, and this is maybe each of the different creatures or people or entities, whatever. You wouldn't probably use the term creatures, of conscious beings. So, here are all the different ones. And what you're trying to do is say, well, here's this well-being, here's this well-being, here's this level of well-being. That what you're trying to do is to maximize the area under this curve. That maximizing well-being for conscious creatures is what is moral. So anything that maximizes the well-being of conscious creatures is what is moral. Now, what he does do is turn around, and this is what Craig criticized him for, is he says some of these high points right here are occupied by psychopaths who, when they're acting psychopathically, feel their greatest well-being, according to them. And the problem is, he also acknowledges that what those psychopaths do is morally wrong. So Craig points out that that's a problem because you're saying it's both identical, that that's what is good and it's what is wrong, and that's a contradiction and therefore can't be true. That should be enough to silence the argument. But let's go a step further for this purpose. Let's say that that Sam Harris is right. So we're going to grant that what he says is exactly right. Now here's the question. How do you know what's morally right or wrong? And Sam Harris says it's as obvious as it is in health. Well, let me bring this idea up.
That's ad hoc.
Well, it's better. Yeah, it is ad hoc, but watch this. So here we are. We're on planet Earth. These are a bunch of human beings, and let's say that we were really good at figuring out what makes everybody maximally happy. But what we find out is there's an alien species en route here to Earth. They'll be here in 20 years, and they are capable. First off, they live far more efficiently than we do. So for every resource we consume, they only need 1/100th of that resource to live as long as we do. Additionally, they live for 10,000 years each. And additionally, their well-being capacity, their ability to be happy, exceeds ours tenfold. So on our happiest day, we're a 1 on their scale. At their happiest day, they're 10 times as happy as we can possibly be. So in terms of universal well-being, this other species of alien far exceeds our capacity for maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures. What that means is, that means that we're consuming resources today that if we left around for them to consume, would sustain them for millions of years longer than it would for us, and that overall universal happiness in the universe would be millions and millions and millions of times greater than it would be if we consumed those resources. What's our moral obligation? Suicide. The morally right thing to do there is for every human being on Earth to kill themselves, because that would maximize universal well-being. For the humans that choose not to, what's our moral duty as people who understand and believe this? To kill them. It's morally obligatory for us to commit genocide against the human race, because this alien species will increase the area under the curve greater than we ever possibly could. Now the problem is, how do we know such a species is coming? So is such a species coming to this planet? Anybody know? You would have to know whether they're coming to this planet.
No,
because the different, well, here, if there's one out there, you say that, but what if you're wrong? If the aliens are coming, then it's our moral duty to commit genocide and mass suicide. If they're not coming, then what would genocide and mass suicide be? Morally abhorrent. It would be the worst thing to do. What we need to do is maximize human flourishing, right? But since we don't know, we literally don't know whether genocide is right or wrong. What would we have to know? We'd have to know whether the aliens are coming or not. And not only that, we'd have to know whether aliens are coming in the future. We'd have to know where aliens would be and what superluminal travel would take. In short, we'd have to know everything about the universe, both past, present, and future, in order to do it. What's the only being that we've thought about that knows all the universe, past, present, and future? It's God, which means only, even on Sam Harris's viewpoint, only a God can tell you whether genocide is right or wrong, literally. Whether genocide is morally praiseworthy or morally abhorrent.
Right.
So on Sam Harris's view, which is constructed to be how to get objective moral values out without a God, it turns out that only a God can tell you whether genocide is right or wrong. That is a very powerful point when you sit and you think about it. Not mine. Sam Harris's is the guy that took us to that one. He didn't go all the way.
Right, so he just gave the defense for why the Israelites were commanded to commit genocide against certain kingdoms.
Yeah. So all of that comes back on the table in terms of we should probably talk about this if we're willing to talk about Sam Harris's moral landscape. Okay, Dan, and then I've got one quick administrative note.
You have a lot of assumptions inside of that. I understand you did a short version, but
yes.
One of them is resource limitation versus resource, sort of infinite amount of resources.
Yes, the economist comes out of it.
The stacked happiness. So it's like, we're talking about happiness, but we have more people, more species, humans and aliens. You'd have to argue and say, no, we would actually need maximum for resource use as opposed to just maximum happiness across the
Yeah, I tried to frame it in such a way that meant the aliens were going to get more out of it than we would. Yeah.
But you should still look at the whole happiness. So right there, we're stacking.
Yes.
So aliens can bring this much, but we're on top of that.
Yes, that's right. Well, the problem is the aliens can't live for as long as we, they're out of the resources of their planet. They're coming to the next planet. So they have to consume resources in order to live. So do we let them live or do we let us live?
How can we both live?
Because each human life is reducing the total amount of happiness by a factor of 10,000 or more.
Because
if you killed off the human and you had another alien consume that one, 10,000 times more total happiness would result.
But you lost the happiness.
Yeah, but it was like this. But that's like saying I threw away a penny, but I got a $100 bill.
That's all under the frame of Sam Harris.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think Sam Harris is right about that. But yeah, I think it mixes up the effect and the cause. Okay, thank you guys. So something Eric and I have talked about for a while is like, are there any videos or stuff that we have wanted to do? And I've kind of resisted doing it, but now this has changed my mind. So I wondered, like I've not talked about this problem of evil stuff before. Now we just talked about it in front of 700-800 people. So what, like, I think it's time for that idea to come out into broader cultural discussion. And so I'm wondering whether or not we take Eric up on his offer of basically, I think that there are a number of videos that we can do, short videos ranging from 5 to maybe longer, on the topics of like what some of the unique thinking from this class, which is problem of evil, maybe Trinity modes, Trinity, yeah, the MGB arguments. I think that there's a kind of the universal paradox solution. There's a simulation theory, which is what he and I have been talking about for a very long time, and the subsequent paper. So this paper I took to MIT, and the conference was very interested in it, which I didn't think was going to be the case. But we've got at least 5 or 6. I can think of 6 or 7 more, 6 or 7 total that to me are obvious. This is interesting stuff, and it seems like it's interesting. I was surprised by the number of people that showed up to this thing. Did that surprise you at all? Mm. Like, these are not exciting events. Yeah, like this is a. What are you going to do on a Monday night? I'm going to go listen to 2 people who are trenchantly involved in their own position, who aren't going to change their mind, stand up and make arguments that have probably been made lots of times before by more eloquent people in better frameworks.
That most likely won't change what I believe anyway.
Right, yeah. Right. Where is the like? Man, go to a Capitals game.
Well, and what got me was the vast majority of the questions afterwards had nothing to do with what either of you talked about, which had me wondering the value of such an event. Right? When neither person gets up there and talks about evolution, right? And the majority of the questions are evolution, right? Like, but why hold an event when people are going, not listening, and then just trying to gotcha the speakers about a different topic?
So the idea there is that people are more interested in these topics, and maybe more than these. We'd add to this one, evolution. Yeah. The people are so interested in these topics, they'll go and do something tangentially related just to be in a position where they can think about this and potentially interact a little bit more. So since that's the case, I guess what I'm saying is maybe it's time to do this. And so, what those look like, why don't we discuss a little bit in class at some point? But I have some ideas, but all of our ideas together will be better than my ideas. So if that's the case, and if you guys are willing to support, we may make this the summer project for Solid Ground. Thoughts from the actual masters?
Now, can I just add that
Please.
If anyone wants to support this initiative, just talk to us, and then we'll figure out where we can best use the resources within this room to be effective. Doing that short form video or podcast type setup or couch conversation type situation. Let's figure that out together. And I mentioned, Scott said, Mike, you have this idea for a software front-end, a survey-like thing. Those are really cool ideas too. Ultimately, to build utility that people can take home and whatnot. So if you have something like that, I know people who can help write code for you if you have the ideas mapped out. All that to say, if you have feedback or have suggestions, let's work together and we can build something cool.
All right, we'll continue talking about this for as long as people want to. For the new faces here, welcome. We enjoyed having you here. We'd love to hear your thoughts on both how this stuff went and the new ideas that we'll generate within the following classes. For those that are not familiar with what Solid Ground is, obviously we're just doing a little bit of a minor hot wash of the debate. Normally speaking, this is a facilitated discussion where the purpose is to discuss ideas and questions that you've had to which you have never heard an adequate response. And our goal in this class is to continue to outline those, to work on those problems and responses to the point where you say, yeah, you know what, that's an adequate response. You don't always get there, but I would say that when we don't get there, it's more because sometimes the person had a pre-commitment and didn't want to hear what the answer was at the end of the day. But we certainly are willing to dig as deep as humanly possible here. Yes, sir.
No, I was just saying, we're done. Yeah.
Yeah.
We got people at the door.
We always do, don't we?
Yes.
All right. Thank you all. We'll see you. God be with you this week. We'll see you next time.